in the future. In Cartagena, you'll be having the opportunity to be looking at this in further detail with people knowing what's going on. So you'll have a appetizer knowing what's going to be happening, and so you can understand what we're talking about. So we've split this presentation in a series of points. First, we would like to speak about the regulation and general characteristics of PPPs. A second part where we would like to go through the checklist and the questions you should ask yourself before you start. Questions that you can go through and know that you have the will to go through it. What are the process? What are the types of prior initiatives or PPPs that exist? What are the differences? To finally end with the contract award, a PPP, the phases, the risks, and some small brief conclusions. In Colombia, the PPPs are defined by the regulation itself, everything that has to do with regulated aspects in the country, and PPPs are understood as an instrument of bringing private equity materialized in a contract that's been awarded or celebrated between a private entity and the state entity that has the obligation of providing that public services together with all the various provisioning, construction, transport. So these are the four general characteristics that have been identified in the PPPs. The first aspect is that it must be a provision of public goods and services, which are obviously an obligation of the state. Fundamental that there's a connection of private capital for that partnership. There's a target risk transfer, and that's the reason why sometimes PPPs are so popular, because there's a risk. So we'll go through looking at the selection process, and we'll understand what is the identification and distribution of risks. And a very important aspect in PPPs is the aspect of payments, and different to how traditional construction contracts were being celebrated. It's not just the undertaking of a activity, because those of you that know specifically about this topic, you'll know that the most common topic would be an anticipated payment. So the contractor was given a percentage of the contract without having complied with any of the contract. And that's a fundamental change. The economic aspect depends on the compliance and the satisfaction level of the execution. So they start to structure these PPPs, and will start to define those milestones within the contract that will define the aspect of payments. The concept of PPPs in the country is quite well developed, and according to national planning, through to 2035 we have 431 trillion pesos that will be executed through PPPs. The largest is 208 trillion pesos that plan to be going through the intermodal transport master plan, but we've also got IT, water systems, solid waste management, housing. So in total, those 431 trillion pesos that have been allocated to be executed upon through to 2035 are in the most important aspects of the economy. So the message is, it is a field in which the national government has special interest in its execution, that resources be allocated, and there are very considerable opportunities. It's not just the creation of a law just to comply with certain parameters, but rather it's the will of the national government to execute contracts through PPPs, and for that we need experienced companies with a lot of execution capability. So it's important that foreign investors are aware of that, and they would know that there are those real opportunities to be able to execute contracts of very high importance in the country. As I was showing you, PPPs in the presentation that we were going through, they have been derived of the of Law 1508 of 2012. It's important to understand that one of the most important aspects and the differential between Law 1508 of 2012 and Law 80 PPPs, only legal people or person entities are those that are capable of participating because of economic security. Where we look at the conditions that are required to be able to execute, we'll be looking at the minimum quantities to be able to participate in these contracts are quite high, and this is due to economic and legal security, whether they are national or international legal people, legal person, not only national. Now, sure, it's an exceptional clause. There is a participation of Law 80 in the selection process and the kind of contracts. Now, PPPs may have their own legal regime. The legal processes are defined in Law 80, that is through public tenders, and these are the topics that are looked at through the partnerships. Now, the Law 1508 is regulated by Decree 1467 of 2012, which is developed in a general manner, and an important aspect that is going to catch your attention, draw your attention, is that PPPs, the exceptional clauses do apply that we were looking at yesterday. So, and if we are looking at public resources, then exceptional clauses will apply. Unilateral interpretation, the reversion when we've been speaking of concession contracts, and expiration, as we know, of all public contracts. Now, once we are in that context, we would like to show you what are the basic questions that you must ask yourself when you are going to be identifying a PPP that you would like to participate in, and what should you answer to or respond to be able to continue with that process. The law defines that in order to begin PPPs, we must comply with these four requirements. That is, the investment should be more than 6,000 legal minimum salaries. A project that I have identified and thought about, if it's in total quantity, it does not go beyond 6,000 minimum salaries, then it is not the objective of PPP, so it would not even pass the first feasibility filter. Once this value has been quantified, now this is the total value, this is not the value of private investment, it is the total value of the contract. Private investment might be lower, but the important thing is that the total value goes beyond 6,000 minimum salaries. Now, once the value of the contract has been defined, then we would like to see that if in the sector where we are interested in invested in, there might be some kind of regulation or specific legislation for the investment of resources. So every sector of the economy is managed in an independent manner under its own economic rules. Now, in that same order of ideas, every sector is autonomous to say if they are going to accept or not the investment of private resources. For that reason, when we define or decide if we're going to invest in a PPP, we have to review if that sector has some kind of restriction, in that regard. If we find that there is no restriction in the investment or the private resources for that sector of the economy, then we would have complied with the second requirement so that a PPP can be feasible. The third aspect is the object. What are we going to do with that PPP? What is our interest? If our interest is in aspects of design and construction, repair or improvement, operation and maintenance of networks, infrastructure, public services, state services, then we can continue with our PPP. They are not for all state contracts, only for those that have the objective of design and construction, repair, improvement, operation, and maintenance of whatever we consider is pertinent. And finally, if this infrastructure will be for public use. If finally or ultimately the contract that will be awarded will give a benefit to citizens and the state, not a particular benefit. If we have complied with these four aspects and we've been able to tick off all of these four questions, then we can start our private initiative, our PPP. Those are the most important aspects that you must bear in mind when you identify and structure a PPP. So, to whom should you present the initiative? Well, you've already identified what you're going to do, how much is it going to cost, what is the specific activity that you'll be carrying out, then to whom should you present the initiative? It's not only the state that awards contracts, there are territorial entities, the department states or municipalities that also have certain responsibility for public services. So you can not only present PPPs to the state, to territorial entities, mayor offices, governor offices, and the various entities. So the important thing is to define who is the true interested party and who has the competency of that service. If that service is led by the national government, then this must be presented to the national government, to the territorial entity. If we're talking about infrastructure, then it's ANI. But if we're talking about roads in Bogota, then ANI is not competent because it is something pertinent to Bogota. So the initiative must be presented onto the transport secretary depending on the activity. So it's important to understand when you're going to be defining the objective and the activity that you're going to be carrying out. You also must define the person that is responsible and who's going to be providing that service so that the initiative will be presented onto the responsible entity. If it's not, then it will be rejected. And so it will bring hindrances and obstacles and it will be rejected and it must be then redirected to the competent party. Alright, so carrying on with the order of the presentation, and I would like to add to what Carlos has just said. Many times you'll find projects that have more than one competence, and it might be more than one municipality, more than one entity. It's important that you would negotiate and reach an agreement to those municipalities. So never limit yourself to present it to ANI and believe that ANI is the only entity that is going to decide on infrastructure of the country, because mayor offices on the territorial uh, authority, they are also in charge of authorizing PPPs. So looking at the order, we'll be looking at the types of PPPs, focusing on what was of most importance for you, which is the public or the private initiative. Now, the law 1508 that Carlos already mentioned, it proposes three PPPs. Public initiative, firstly, which is where states will go out to do prior studies, look at feasibility, and determine the contract in a specific way that is going to be determining the PPP. In this case of public initiative, the resources in most cases will be derived from the state itself. We then go on to seeing private initiative without public resources, which is the one where you can come to the country and say, I was looking at the national development plan for the next 4 years, and I can see that there's the need for a road where it's needed at the south of Colombia. So I want to do a private initiative to execute a road there and be able to benefit myself and then give it back to the state. So you will be in charge of carrying out those prior studies, and you will look at the reality of those studies to see if what you were designing was feasible, and that would then be something that is of your own exclusive responsibility. We'll be looking at this in further detail, which is the one that we've given most importance, understanding the people that have attended this event. But then there's also the possibility of a mix between these two, and it's where you're carrying out the studies of being able to manage all of that which is prior to execution and looking at the execution of the contract. But you receive monetary support from the state. So understanding this, I would like us to look at the differences of the approval process, looking both at the private initiative with public resources and without public resources. So let's look at the one without public resources. So the four questions must be asked, as Carlos mentioned. It is fundamental that they would go beyond a minimum value, that they would be for public use, that they would be of construction, and the most important thing is the differentiator there is that there is operation and maintenance, because when there's operation and maintenance during that time, it's looking at the invested time that you have put in there. So looking at this first stage, it's pre-feasibility. So it's a primary study of the PPP where you're showing the objective of the PPP. Who are you? Why do you want to present this? And they relate this with the development plan, with the National Territorial Ordinance or Ordinance Survey. And we're not limited that this would be only just road projects, and looking at that pre-feasibility with the competent authority, it can be one or several. Then you can receive the approval if the competent entity, one or several, determine that you or the project is of their interest and it is according to what they have budgeted for in their government plan. So this first step is normally the most simple of all of them, but it gives you a way of knowing what are the interests of the entity and being able to work on the next phase upon those interests. So the next interest is the feasibility where the analysis is deeper. So there we require financial in-depth analysis, and it's also looking at risk analysis. This is the topic where in principle it's mostly been defined, but it looks at private entities. Now, as we would compare the public-private, this is one of the deliverables that we have to do in the feasibility stage, and it's about you proving that the way that you are carrying out the PPP is necessary, and it's better that you would carry it out instead of the entity carrying it out through public contracting. So it is indispensable, it is one of the most important deliverables in this feasibility stage, together with all of the land studies about the places where the infrastructure is going to be carried out, the networks that you will have to move if the infrastructure is going to be crossing a place where there are already networks, then knowing how is that foreseen in your financial model. So all of these are in the feasibility stage, and this is where the approval will take longest for the PPP discussions in terms of network, land allocation, are much deeper with the entities, and especially in the ANI, where in spite of all of the things that have happened lately, there are quite qualified people working there. So it's important that the studies that are taken on in this phase are well developed and would allow to sustain the financial feasibility, which is ultimately the one that you want to demonstrate to the ANI of the PPP. Once the feasibility has been seen with the competent authority, then the entity must see that this is all feasible and that this project can be carried out in the way that you have foreseen it. Then it then gives viability. And what happens here is quite important. When the entity says you can go ahead with your PPP, you come into a negotiation, term of acceptance for 2 months, and you will say the PPP will be carried out in this way. But the most important thing in this topic is how much did it cost you for the two previous phases? Why? Because we perhaps did not clarify it at the beginning, but the fact that you presented a private initiative, just because you presented it, it's yours. So you will go into a competitive process, and it's important that during this phase, you would negotiate the value for which you carried out pre-feasibility and feasibility uh, studies, because these will be acknowledged. So it's important that you would agree with the entity to say, okay, carried out these studies, and it would that cost me 50,000 million, and they will be acknowledged. In the case that you are selected, then you will be paid for those costs. So it's the way that you would be guaranteed those that have private initiative, and that when they went through pre-feasibility and feasibility phases, that when they will not lose the resources to be able to advance in the pre-feasibility and feasibility phases. Now, once that negotiation has come to an end and they have accepted the terms, then we have a time or phase of publishing what has been agreed, the contract that's going to be regulating the PPP and the studies that gave way to that contract. The publication phase is foreseen to be 1 to 6 months by law. And what is the purpose of that? So that people will participate. When they see that, they will be able to manifest their interest, and they'll say, I will be submitting my application. And we come then into an abbreviated process, which, as you've been told, is like a mini tender, public tender process, but it's rather that the terms that are given to each stage, the phase time is much shorter. So in this process, it might you might be given the award, and we will be looking at, if there's no third party interested, then you will also be awarded. But it's very important to bear this in mind, because sometimes you're given the idea, oh, I structured it and I should be awarded it. No, you come into a process to compete with all of those that are manifesting their interest into this stage. That those that will execute their contract, which unfortunately might not be you, they will acknowledge the studies that you did carry out to look at the PPP. If we look at the difference to this process without public resources, and this one with public resources, both stages, first two stages are the same time as well. 3 months for the entity to see if the entity says it's feasible to carry out. 6 months plus 3 for approval. What happens here? The difference is that what is seen is that there's a public tender process. Why? Because the public tender process, the regulation has found that the public tender process brings in guarantees in the topic that they are using public resources. So the basic difference between the process of public resources for private initiative and that without is that you will be coming into a abbreviated process, whereas here you'll have a public tender process, given that public resources are in the second case. And it's important that you take into account that all private initiative will be having competition processes. So that does not imply you are guaranteed the award of the process. What are the advantages and disadvantages? We can say here in Colombia, come and do your private your initiative and see if you can win it. No, we've given some advantages to the originators of that initiative, those that decided to take on the costs for the structuring of the project. And what are those benefits? Well, we reiterate the differences here, but the benefits when they obtain public resources is that in the final qualification of that public resources, you will receive an additional score in that, depending on the value of the contract. It can be between 3 to 10 points. That is a very important qualification bonus. If you participated in selection processes in Colombia, sometimes they can be defined just by 1 point. So this bonus, if it maybe does not totally guarantee that you would be the award winners, but it is an important advantage that can help you win it. This is quite important, and I wanted to mention this, and it's the difference when it includes public resources and when it does not. The difference, one of the main differences is this, and that is that you must go through a Council of Social and Economic Policy, and I think it's been mentioned quite a lot, COMPES and CONFIS, and that is the approval of a new institution, well, not new, that decides the economic and social policy for the next few years in Colombia, and that must approve that project which has public resources so that it can be further on. Now, with no public resources, it does not require the approval of COMPES and CONFIS. So, as I mentioned, this bonus that you're given here for not having public resources, it might not guarantee that you are awarded the contract, but it is quite an important added value. By our own experience, sometimes the award can be defined by 1 point, but the bonus is even better when it does not require public resources, because you will present your proposal and a new bidder will come in and say, I will offer much less. So that would improve their score. And what does the law says? Well, if it's within the margin of 20% of what you manage, I offered 100, I offered 80, well, I can still uh, lower my offer. It does not guarantee of 11 PPPs without public resources that have been awarded today. It's only happened in one of them where this benefit has not been able to be guaranteed to the one that executed. Just in one tender, the person went beyond 20%, so it was impossible for the person that had carried out the pre-feasibility and feasibility studies would not be awarded the contract. So, if it well is true that nobody is guaranteeing the execution of the contract, there is the possibility, a high probability, that you would be awarded. We're giving you 2 bonuses. If it's without public resources, we're doing this. If it's public resources, we're giving you the additional qualification bonus. And if it is not with public resources, then we can equal the offer if it's not 20% lower than yours. So I think these are benefits that should be an incentive so that you would initiate a PPP here in Colombia. There are different contracts of private initiatives, but we've decided to analyze a road contract, which was the last one that was awarded by PPP, and we would like to show you how that contract works in detail in distributing the risks, in how the contract is paid, how they will receive their income, and what are the phases, the most important phases of the contract to bear in mind, and how it was structured that way. Why did we do that? Because I think it's easier or better for a private initiative to be approved if one took into account all of this instead of proposing something totally new. Now, if you look into detail, each of the PPP private initiative without public resources, the contracts are practically the same. So the ideal thing is that in your benefits and PPP, then contracts that you pretend to sign will have these same conditions. In first place, how do you receive income from a PPP in Colombia? The first income that you will receive is the income for infrastructure use. What does that mean? In an airport, airport fees, in a road, well, obviously it will be the tolls. And so this is fundamental. This is the strongest base of the income that you will be receiving. In terms of those with public funds, then the income will come in from those public resources. Now, additional to these income, because of the use of infrastructure, we have commercial exploitation of the infrastructure that you are building. For example, in an airport, there will be publicity, advertising, billboards on the side of the road. So understand that your income sources in private aspects would be private initiatives would be limited to these three aspects, but not only limited to that, but for you to be given the resources for each of these three criteria, you must uh, hand in or deliver part of a functional unit. This is important because a functional unit is the condition, the requisite for you to be given money in a PPP. What is a functional unit? I have a road from here. I'm going to give a, you might be lost in the example. Uh, it's a road from here to Girardot. So I've divided it in three functional units. I divided in a functional unit that goes from Bogota to the next 30 kilometers, then the next 30 kilometers, and the one that goes right through to the end of the destination. Until each of those functional units can depend or work independently. The other will connect Colombia to its surroundings, etc. So until I do not deliver the first functional unit, that functional unit that can work independently to the others, then I will not be given the resources. And that is a very important condition, and it's important that when we structure your project, you bear in mind those functional units, because it is on the basis of that that you will be given the resources. So this condition is very important, and I would like this to be one of the things that you take away with the benefits that you've learned, because on the basis of the construction of this, that you'll be given payments. Of course, for all of this to not be limited and that the contract will not be broken, then there will be special cases that you have completed 50% of the functional units, then we'll give you 40% of the resources that correspond to the building of that functional unit. They did that to not paralyze the works, but the totality of the resources for that functionality will only be deposited in your favor when you deliver that functional unit, and that is the essence of the PPP. There is no way that you will receive resources until that you do not deliver infrastructure. What happens when you deliver the infrastructure? Well, there are minimum service levels. So the payment of the income during the operation and maintenance will be derived of those service levels that you maintain. The income will not be lowered according to the contract, and if it's maintained, then you will receive most of the contracts. They are looked at on a monthly basis, so there are different ways of the contract.
What are the different stages of the contract that have been foreseen? As I said before, we have taken one of the last contracts from a private initiative, and we believe that you should base it on this for your approval, for effective approval. The first stage is the pre-construction stage. So what usually happens in this stage? The timetable for the works that you will perform is defined, the time you will spend building each functional unit, because this was not defined in the selection process. The financial close is performed, so that means you can find the necessary debt for the execution of your project, and we start to buy the buildings. As I said before, that is indispensable for roads. If I'm going to build a road, I need to buy the buildings that are there. So one of the important things to do, or three of the important things, are the following, so that there are no additions to the contract. After overcoming the execution process that usually lasts a year, or the pre-construction stage rather. The pre-construction phase is short, a year. The construction phase depends on the complexity of the contract. We've seen 4-year long contracts, 10 years, but usually, if it goes beyond 7 years, then it's quite complex. In the construction phase, we comply with the works timetable, and we start to deliver functioning units. This means that from the construction stage, you can receive exploitation income for the works, because if I've given them a working unit, then I start to receive income. Once I deliver it from the construction stage, I can start to receive money. This means that the construction cannot be under you if you are not paid for it. The idea is to guarantee that you can execute it using concession resources and execute the rest of the works with the resources. After the construction stage, I'd say that construction and O&M are the most complex part, and then we need maintenance. This takes the longest time, so around 25 years in total, and you should maintain the works that you carried out, maintain the level of services as well, and that's where you get most of the payback that you invested. So this is the most important thing with regards to income, and you should have the level of services foreseen in the contract so that you can get back your investment resources. Then, when the contract reaches year 29, and you have to make sure that the infrastructure is back at the same state to continue to offer services, we have the reversion clause. It's an exceptional clause, and its intention is to guarantee the service by returning your resources from the state, so that they can once again create a bidding process for road infrastructure. So this is the analysis of one of the contracts. PPPs can vary given their complexity, etc. But we're going to show you how risk transfer takes place in the last contract for the private initiative carried out in Colombia. So what happens to the risks in contracts for private initiatives and public resources? As the graph clearly shows, they will go from the state to the individual. If there haven't been any compensation measures in the presence of certain risks, but all the risks, given that you carried out the studies, and let's say that I've looked at the feasibility, you actually carry out the studies and have the initiative, therefore you will be in charge of taking on each of the risks foreseen in the contract. What kind of compensation mechanisms do we have? So you need to add them up and see how you can solve this in reality, but I think there are mechanisms that are rather interesting, and I think they will continue to work in the same way in public-private contracts. What are the most common risks found by the National Infrastructure Agency, or ANI, that they believe are so important and may occur that they have put these mechanisms in place? So income risks, they could reduce throughout the execution of the contract. Risks of acquiring or procuring the buildings, environmental risks, and network risks. For each of these risks, we have foreseen a compensation mechanism. How has this been done? The individual, the owner of the initiative, or the person with the adjudication takes on the risk. If for any reason, for any of these 4 reasons, these costs are generated, they must foresee the financial model costs and an additional 20%, and this is taken on in totality by the individual executing the works. So basically you take on up to 120% of that which has been foreseen in the financial model, so 100% plus 20%. So you will be in charge of it up to this point. If procurement for buildings is 20% higher than you had foreseen in the financial model, then it's your responsibility. What happens if it goes beyond 20%, beyond that extra 20%, if you need to transfer networks or buy buildings? The state will come and provide some compensation, and I'll explain how. But I want you to look at these figures. When it's over 20%, this additional cost in any of these areas, then it's divided into 70-30, a ratio. 70% of those additional costs that go beyond the 20% of the value foreseen in the beginning will be the entity's responsibility, and 30% will be the contractor's responsibility. What happens if it goes beyond 100% of that which had been pre-established for, say, these four aspects? The totality will be taken on by the entity. What are the mechanisms that the entity has put in place? If there is an excess of income throughout the execution of the contract, the entity ensures that this excess of income will cover the overcosts of either of these. Additionally, we have foreseen an increase in rates for infrastructure use. This compensation mechanism has only been budgeted if there is lower income than has been foreseen. For the other ones, we do not have this compensation mechanism. This means that if the additional income that had been foreseen is not enough to compensate for the procurement of infrastructure or venues, then I'll say okay, or for the other ones I'll say okay, that's not enough, so we need to extend the term of the contract. I think this will be the most popular one, the one they use the most, and they'll say okay, well, you need to invest more, but I'm going to give you more time so that you can have greater access to resources and therefore compensate for your investment. So what is the worst case? And I've made this darker, this box. Worst case scenario, let's say you could not compensate through additional income or by extending the term of the contract. This means you need to negotiate a change in the scope of the contract with the entity, and I think that this is the last one, the last option, and this is once the risk has gone beyond our ability to foresee it and resolve it. So do take into account that although you will take on all the risks, for these four risks, the ANI has foreseen or pre-established certain compensation mechanisms, and in your model you will determine if that is enough or not. I think that just to end, we wanted to show you that in Colombia the PPP model has been successful, and we wanted to show you 4 contracts where we have been carrying these out, which has perhaps affected the rest that have been in the feasibility or pre-feasibility stage. Ibagué, Cajamarca, the road network in Meta, it was adjudicated 2 years ago and is currently being executed. This one between Ibagué and Cajamarca is operating. Cesar La Guajira is another important road that was a private initiative, and Cambiao to Manizales includes public resources, although it's private, and it was adjudicated to a consortium, although, as pointed out by Carlos, this can only be adjudicated to legal persons who have been registered in Colombia. The danger there is that they can, or rather they can hire consortiums to do the work. So with this, we'd like to invite you, and we hope that you feel a little bit calmer now, that you know that the model, the PPP model, has been developed well in Colombia. Because if you're going to favor the country by developing a private initiative, you will also be benefited, because the same person who builds it should be the person who executes it, because they have been given advantages. So we wanted to show you that there have been, say, successful private initiatives, projects, and also plant a seed, because we're talking about private initiatives here only, but there are also public initiatives that you could participate in without taking on the costs of the study that this requires. I don't know if you perhaps have any questions about this, or if everything was clear through the presentation.